The cemetery record showed her burial date as March 15, 2019. Plot 847. Section C, beneath a granite headstone that read, Elena Rodriguez, beloved daughter, devoted soldier. The military honors had been full dress. The flag had been folded 13 times and handed to her mother with trembling white gloves. The case file was stamped classified and buried deeper than her supposed grave. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But 5 years later, in a remote valley of Montana where cell towers couldn't reach and satellite coverage came in fragments, someone was watching through a scope that hadn't been manufactured in any known facility. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like smoke from a dying fire. Elena Rodriguez adjusted her position on the rocky outcrop, barely disturbing the layer of pine needles she'd carefully arranged around her hide. The ghillie suit she wore wasn't a military issue. She'd crafted it herself from local vegetation, threads pulled from old wool blankets, and fabric dyes mixed from berries and bark. Every strand had been placed with the precision of a surgeon, every shadow calculated to match the terrain. Through her scope, she tracked the movement of the elk herd below. Not hunting them, just watching, learning their patterns the way she'd once learned the habits of targets half a world away. The matriarch led with cautious steps, ears rotating like radar dishes, nostrils testing air currents for danger that might be miles away. Elena respected that kind of awareness. It had kept her alive when everyone else thought she was dead. The rifle beside her was a work of art disguised as scrap metal. The barrel had been hand-machined in a workshop that officially didn't exist. Chambered for rounds, she loaded herself with powder measurements precise to the grain. The stock was carved from black walnut she'd seasoned for 3 years, fitted to her shoulder and cheek with microscopic adjustments until it felt like an extension of her skeleton. No serial numbers, no manufacturer's marks, no record that it had ever been built. She'd learned to shoot at age 7 on her grandfather's ranch outside Bakersfield, where the sound of gunfire was as common as morning coffee. By 12, she could put 3 rounds through the same hole, at 200 yards. By 16, she was out shooting Marine recruiters who'd come to her high school career, fair-wearing confident smiles and crisp dress blues. They'd stopped smiling when she'd cleared their qualification course with a score they'd never seen from a teenager. The Army had noticed. Special Operations had taken a closer look. By 19, Elena Rodriguez was learning skills that didn't appear in any training manual, in facilities that weren't marked on any map, from instructors whose names she was never allowed to know. Her first confirmed kill had been at 847 yards in a place the briefings called Grid 7 Echo, though the locals called it Hell's Kitchen for reasons that had nothing to do with cooking. The target had been a bomb maker whose devices had killed 14 civilians in the previous month. Elena had waited in position for 36 hours, motionless, breathing shallow, pulse steady as a metronome. When the shot came, it was poetry written in mathematics. Wind speed, humidity, temperature, elevation, the Coriolis effect, the slight drift of her target's movement as he'd stepped through a doorway that would only be clear for 1.3 seconds. Bullet had traveled for nearly 3 seconds before impact. In that time, Elena had already begun her withdrawal, gear packed with the efficiency of years spent moving without trace. By the time the target's security team had figured out where the shot had originated, she was 2 miles away and invisible. But that kind of precision, that level of skill, made certain people nervous. Not the enemy, the bureaucrats. The career officers who'd never pulled a trigger in combat, but understood the politics of perception. A 19-year-old woman who could kill with surgical precision from distances that challenged physics wasn't a convenient narrative for public consumption. They'd moved her to a unit that didn't officially exist. Missions that never happened. Operations with no paper trail and no witnesses. Elena Rodriguez became a ghost long before the world thought she was dead. Her service record showed routine deployments, standard infantry rotations, the kind of assignments that looked unremarkable. In a file folder. The reality was different. She'd spent 2 years moving through countries that weren't on the evening news, eliminating threats that would never be mentioned in congressional hearings. Her longest confirmed kill was 1,247 yards, a shot taken in weather conditions that should have made accuracy impossible. The target had been a warlord whose private army had been trafficking children across 3 borders. Elena had waited 4 days for the perfect window, subsisting on rainwater and nutrition bars, never moving more than inches from her firing position. The shot had been perfect. The aftermath had been messy. Political complications, shifting alliances, questions from oversight committees who weren't supposed to know her unit existed in the first place. Elena Rodriguez had become a liability not because she couldn't do the job, but because she was too good at it. The cover story had been elegant in its simplicity. A training accident during a routine exercise, an explosion, no remains recovered. Deep condolences to the family. Flag-draped coffin filled with sandbags and fragments of equipment that could have belonged to anyone. Elena had watched her own funeral through binoculars from a ridge 2 miles away. She'd seen her mother collapse at the graveside, seen her father's shoulders shake with grief he'd tried to hide behind military bearing. She'd wanted to run to them, to tell them the truth, to end their suffering. But the handlers had made the situation clear. The woman they'd known as Elena Rodriguez was officially dead. Any attempt to contact family or friends would result in making that fiction permanent. So she disappeared into the wilderness like smoke dispersing in the wind. The Montana valley where she'd made her home wasn't on any tourist map. The access roads were unmarked, the property boundaries lost in bureaucratic shuffles between state and federal agencies. She'd built her cabin by hand from timber she'd felled herself, using techniques learned from survival manuals and refined through necessity. Solar panels disguised as weathered roofing provided power. A hand-dug well supplied water filtered through systems she'd engineered from hardware, store components, and military surplus equipment. The nearest neighbor was 14 miles away through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. Supply runs required careful planning and meticulous counter-surveillance. Elena had crafted an identity that would pass casual inspection, but wouldn't survive deep scrutiny. Sarah Mitchell, freelance writer, researching a book about wilderness conservation. She paid cash, kept interactions brief, and moved through town like a shadow at the edge of perception. But she never stopped training, every morning before dawn. She'd run the mountain trails she'd cut herself, carrying a full combat load, building endurance that went beyond what she'd maintained in active service. She'd constructed shooting ranges at various elevations around the valley, each one camouflaged to look like natural rock formations or fallen logs. Distance markers were carved into trees that looked like natural scarring. Wind flags were fashioned from strips of fabric that resembled old survey tape left by forgotten geological surveys. Her longest range extended to 1,800 yards, a distance that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible with the equipment she'd assembled. At that range, a target the size of a playing card became a mathematical equation involving dozens of variables. Elena had learned to read atmospheric conditions like a meteorologist, to calculate ballistics like a physicist, to control her breathing and heartbeat like a monk in deep meditation. She practiced with ammunition she loaded herself, each round crafted with obsessive attention to detail. The brass was sorted by weight down to tenths of grains. Powder charges were measured to tolerances that commercial ammunition couldn't match. Bullets were seeded with pressures checked to ensure consistency that would make the difference between hit and miss at extreme distance. But it wasn't just about the shooting. Elena had maintained every skill that had made her valuable in the field. She could move through the forest so quietly that deer wouldn't look up from grazing. She could read tracks and signs that would tell her when someone had passed through her territory, what they'd been carrying, where they were headed. She could construct shelters that were invisible from 20 feet away, set traps that would stop a squad without leaving evidence of human intervention. The world had forgotten Elena Rodriguez. The military had buried her file so deeply that her former commanding officers would claim never to have heard her name. The bureaucrats who'd made the decision to disappear her had moved on to other problems, other inconvenient solutions. But Elena hadn't forgotten anything. She'd spent 5 years alone in the wilderness, honing skills that had already been beyond military standards, pushing herself to levels of capability that bordered on superhuman. Every sunrise brought another 1,000 rounds of practice. Every sunset ended with technical manuals studied by lamplight, ballistics tables memorized, weather patterns analyzed with the thoroughness of a doctoral dissertation. The elk below finished their morning graze and moved toward the stream that cut through the valley floor. Elena tracked them through her scope, not as targets but as teachers. Their alertness, their unity of movement, their instant response to perceived threats. She'd learned more about tactical awareness from 5 years of watching wildlife than she'd absorbed from any classroom lecture. As the herd disappeared into the timber, Elena began the methodical process of breaking down her position. Every piece of equipment had a designated place in her pack, arranged for silent movement and instant access. The rifle was broken down into components that fit into a case disguised as a photographer's equipment bag. The ghillie suit was rolled and compressed until it looked like a standard military sleeping bag. Within 10 minutes, no trace remained of her presence on the outcrop. The pine needles were rearranged to their natural pattern. The small depression where she'd lain was filled and disguised. Someone could examine the spot with a magnifying glass and find nothing to suggest human occupation. She moved down the slope with the fluid silence of water flowing over stone. Each footstep was placed with deliberate care, weight distributed, to avoid crushing vegetation or disturbing rock that might cascade downhill. Her breathing remained controlled. Her awareness expanded to encompass every sound, every movement, every shift in the natural rhythm of the forest around her. The cabin appeared ahead through the trees, so perfectly camouflaged that even knowing its location required careful observation to pick out the structure from the surrounding landscape. Solar panels were disguised beneath vegetation that grew in carefully maintained patterns. Windows were positioned to avoid reflecting sunlight, their glass treated with coatings that absorbed rather than revealed. Elena paused at the tree line, conducting the security sweep that had become automatic over 5 years of careful survival. Visual scan for anything out of place. Audio analysis for sounds that didn't belong to the natural environment. Even scent detection for traces of human presence that might indicate surveillance or intrusion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nothing. The valley remained as pristine as the morning she'd first arrived, carrying everything she owned in a single pack and a determination to vanish so completely that even she might forget who she'd once been. But some skills, once learned, never fade. Some instincts, once sharpened, never dull. And some purposes, once discovered, wait dormant like seeds in winter soil, ready to grow when conditions become right. Elena Rodriguez was officially dead, buried in a grave that held only empty promises and the grief of people who'd loved her. But the woman who'd taken her place in the Montana wilderness was something more dangerous than any soldier who'd ever worn the uniform. She was a ghost with nothing left to lose and everything necessary to win. The Pentagon's sub-basement level C7 didn't appear on any building schematic. The elevator that accessed it required 2 different keycards and a biometric scan that cross-referenced against a database containing fewer than 200 names. Colonel Marcus Webb had been one of those names for 8 years, long enough to understand that some conversations happened in rooms that officially didn't exist. The conference table was polished mahogany, surrounded by leather chairs that had been sat in by men who made decisions affecting millions of lives. No windows interrupted the wood-paneled walls. No clocks marked the passage of time. The only illumination came from recessed fixtures that cast everything in the sterile glow of fluorescent authority. Webb sat across from Deputy Director Catherine Sterling, a woman whose personnel file listed her as a State Department liaison, but whose real job involved cleaning up messes that threatened to embarrass people with 4-star rank and Senate confirmation hearings. Her gray suit was impeccably tailored, her expression practiced in the art of revealing nothing while communicating everything. "The Rodriguez situation has become untenable," Sterling said, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering bad news without flinching. She slid a manila folder across the table. "Congressional oversight is asking questions we can't answer without exposing operations that don't officially exist." Webb opened the folder to find photographs he'd seen before. Elena Rodriguez at 19. Fresh out of basic training, her smile bright with the confidence of someone who believed the world was a place where skill and dedication mattered more than politics. Elena at 21, receiving a commendation that would never appear in her official record. Elena at 22, her eyes already carrying the weight of things she couldn't discuss with anyone who hadn't signed the same oaths of secrecy. "She's our most effective asset," Webb said, though he already knew the argument was lost. He'd been fighting this battle for months, watching bureaucrats who'd never heard a shot fired in anger make calculations about acceptable risk and plausible deniability. Sterling's expression didn't change. "She's a liability. Senator Morrison's committee is investigating enhanced interrogation protocols. If they dig deep enough, they'll find connections to operations that could expose our entire off-books capability. We have assets in 12 countries. Who would be burned if this goes public?" The euphemisms were careful, practiced. Enhanced interrogation, off-books capability, burned assets. Language designed to create distance between the speaker and the reality of what they were discussing. Elena Rodriguez didn't interrogate people, she killed them. With surgical precision, from distances that challenged the limits of physics. In operations that saved American lives by eliminating threats before they could metastasize, but explaining that to Congress would require admitting that the United States government employed people like Elena Rodriguez. And admitting that would open doors to questions that no one in the building wanted to answer. "There are alternatives to termination," Webb said, though he knew he was grasping at bureaucratic straws. "Reassignment. Different theater of operations. Deep cover work that keeps her useful without the visibility." Sterling pulled out another folder, this one thicker, bound with red tape that indicated classification levels beyond what most generals were authorized to see. "She's been investigated by 3 different oversight committees in the past year. The Church Committee veterans are comparing her to programs they thought they'd shut down in the 70s. There's a congressional aide who's been asking specific questions about sniper operations in theaters we've never officially acknowledged." The weight of institutional memory pressed against the mahogany table like a physical presence. The Church Committee had exposed CIA assassination programs in the 1970s, leading to reforms that were supposed to prevent the government from employing people like Elena Rodriguez. The fact that those reforms had been quietly circumvented in the decades since was a reality that existed in rooms like this one, discussed by people who understood that national security sometimes required moral compromises. "What are you proposing?" Webb asked, though he already knew. The bureaucratic machinery had been set in motion months ago. This conversation was notification, not consultation. Sterling opened the red-taped folder to reveal documents that looked like routine administrative forms but represented something far more final. Death certificates, burial permits, Official notifications of line-of-duty fatalities that would be delivered to grieving families with all the ceremony and sympathy the military could muster. "Training accident," Sterling said, her tone as matter of fact, as if she were discussing lunch plans. "Explosive ordnance disposal exercise. Detonation occurred during equipment malfunction. No remains recovered due to the nature of the blast. Full military honors, flag presentation to next of kin, condolences from the Secretary of Defense." Webb stared at the papers, recognizing the careful craftsmanship of institutional deception. Every detail had been planned to withstand scrutiny. From military investigators, congressional committees, and grieving families who might ask difficult questions. The explosive ordnance story would explain the absence of remains. The classification of the training exercise would prevent detailed investigation. The military honors would provide closure for people who needed to believe their daughter had died serving her country. "She doesn't know," Webb said. "She can't know," Sterling replied. "Elena Rodriguez dies in a training accident. The woman who survives that accident becomes someone else entirely. New identity, new life. Geographic relocation to somewhere that ensures she never encounters anyone from her previous existence." The machinery of disappearance had been refined through decades of practice. New social security numbers generated through systems that left no traceable connection to previous identities. Credit histories constructed from scratch. Employment records created in databases that would pass routine verification. Driver's licenses issued by states that had cooperative relationships with federal security agencies. But Elena Rodriguez wasn't a typical case. Her skill set made her dangerous in ways that couldn't be managed through standard relocation protocols. A woman who could kill with precision from distances measured in miles, who could disappear into terrain that would challenge a Navy SEAL, who possessed knowledge of operations that could embarrass 3 different presidential administrations, couldn't be trusted to simply fade into civilian life. "Ongoing monitoring?" Webb asked. Sterling nodded. "Periodic surveillance, financial tracking, technological monitoring of any attempt to contact family or former associates. Any indication that she's attempting to expose classified information. And we implement permanent solutions." The phrase hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished cigarette. Permanent solutions. Another euphemism for another kind of violence. Carried out by different people with similar skill sets, but fewer moral complications. Webb had spent 28 years in the Army, rising through ranks that required increasingly difficult compromises between idealism and pragmatism. He'd ordered men into combat, knowing some wouldn't return. He'd signed off on operations that pushed the boundaries of international law. He'd made peace with the reality that protecting American interests sometimes required actions that couldn't be discussed in congressional hearings or newspaper editorials. But Elena Rodriguez was different. She wasn't collateral damage or acceptable risk. She was a soldier who'd served with distinction, who'd eliminated threats that would have killed American civilians, who'd done everything her country had asked of her with skill that bordered on artistic achievement, and now her country was discarding her like a piece of equipment that had outlived its usefulness. "Timeline?" Webb asked. Sterling consulted a document that looked like a project management schedule but detailed the systematic erasure of a human being. "Implementation begins next week. Training exercise is scheduled for March 15th. Notification to family members occurs within 24 hours of the reported incident. Memorial service follows standard military protocol, with burial in Arlington if the family requests it. Arlington National Cemetery, where heroes were buried beneath white marble headstones that bore their names and service records for posterity to remember. Elena Rodriguez would be commemorated there with full honors, her grave visited by family. Members who would never know that the person they mourned was still alive, hidden in wilderness so remote that even satellite surveillance might miss her presence. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. A soldier who'd served her country with unprecedented skill would be honored as a martyr. While being punished for that same service, her family would grieve for someone who wasn't dead. Her comrades would remember someone who couldn't defend her own reputation. History would record her as a casualty of training rather than a casualty of politics. Contingencies? Webb asked, though he was running out of objections that mattered. Sterling turned to a section of the folder that detailed scenarios Webb hoped would never be implemented. If she attempts contact with family, immediate intervention, explanation of national security requirements, reminder of legal consequences for violating classification protocols. If she attempts to expose classified information, discreditation through controlled media releases suggesting mental health issues resulting from combat trauma. If she poses an active threat to operational security, permanent resolution through assets who specialize in making problems disappear. Each contingency was documented with the thoroughness of a doctoral dissertation, complete with decision trees that mapped every possible choice Elena Rodriguez might make to consequences that had already been planned in rooms like this one. The system had learned from previous cases where disappeared assets had caused problems. Elena Rodriguez would not be allowed to become one of those problems. Her handler, Webb asked. Agent Harrison will deliver the news personally. She trusts him enough to follow relocation instructions without asking questions that might complicate implementation. He's been briefed on the parameters of her new existence and will ensure compliance with ongoing security requirements. Agent Harrison. Webb knew him as a competent field operative who'd worked with Elena on several missions, building the kind of professional relationship that made difficult conversations possible. Harrison would tell Elena Rodriguez that she'd become too visible, too much of a security risk to continue operating under her current identity. He explained that her service to her country required one final sacrifice, accepting that Elena Rodriguez had to die so that the operations she'd supported could continue protecting American lives, and Elena, being the soldier she was, would probably agree. The meeting continued for another hour, covering logistical details that transformed the abstract concept of disappearance into concrete operational reality. Financial arrangements that would support Elena's new identity without creating traceable connections to government accounts. Medical records that would be transferred under her new name, edited to remove any reference to military service or specialized training. Communication protocols that would allow periodic welfare checks without compromising her location or security. When Sterling finally closed the folders and collected the documents, Webb felt like he'd participated in something that would haunt him for the remainder of his career. Elena Rodriguez wasn't the first soldier to disappear for political convenience, and she wouldn't be the last. The machinery of national security required occasional human sacrifices, and the people who operated that machinery had learned to justify those sacrifices as necessary costs of protecting American interests, but understanding the necessity didn't make it feel any less like betrayal. Webb walked out of the sub-basement conference room, knowing that within a week, one of the finest soldiers he'd ever commanded would officially cease to exist. Her family would grieve. Her comrades would remember her with respect and sadness. The country she'd served would honor her memory while ensuring that her actual survival remained buried deeper than any grave, and somewhere in the wilderness where cell towers couldn't reach and satellite coverage came in fragments, Elena Rodriguez would begin learning that being dead was the most dangerous thing she'd ever survived. The abandoned radar station sat on the ridge like a monument to obsolete technology, built during the Cold War to watch for Soviet bombers that never came. It had been decommissioned in 1987 and left to weather the Montana winters with bureaucratic indifference. The concrete structures were slowly being reclaimed by mountain vegetation, their purpose forgotten by everyone except hikers who occasionally stumbled across them while following unmarked trails. Elena had discovered the facility during her second month in the valley. The access road was overgrown, but still passable with careful navigation. The buildings were structurally sound despite decades of neglect. Most importantly, the location provided clear sight lines across 40 miles of wilderness in 3 directions, making it perfect for purposes the original engineers had never intended. She'd spent 18 months converting the main bunker into a workshop that would have impressed the technicians at Quantico. Hand tools salvaged from abandoned homesteads. Precision equipment ordered through shell companies and delivered to post office boxes in towns she visited once and never returned to. Reference materials acquired from sources that asked no questions and kept no records. The ballistics laboratory occupied what had once been a communications room. Steel benches supported equipment that could measure bullet velocity to within single-digit feet per second. Chronographs captured data that Elena analyzed with the thoroughness of a doctoral candidate, building databases of performance characteristics across temperature ranges, humidity levels, and atmospheric conditions that pushed the boundaries of environmental extremes. She'd learned to cast her own bullets from alloys, mixed in proportions that weren't available in any commercial ammunition. Lead hardened with antimony and tin in ratios she'd calculated through experimentation that consumed thousands of rounds and filled notebooks with data points that looked like physics equations. Each bullet was weighed on scales accurate to hundredths of grains, sorted into batches with tolerances that would make Swiss watchmakers proud. The powder room contained components that couldn't be purchased through normal channels. Chemical compounds acquired through agricultural suppliers who assumed she was loading rounds for prairie dog control. Industrial chemicals ordered from laboratory supply companies under the pretense of water quality testing. Elena had taught herself chemistry through technical manuals and trial and error experimentation, learning to blend propellants that burned with consistency unmatched by anything available to civilian shooters. Load development consumed weeks of methodical testing. Each powder charge was weighed to tolerances measured in tenths of grains. Seeding depth was adjusted in thousandths of an inch until groups tightened to levels that defied statistical probability. Elena would fire 5-shot strings at targets placed at distances that required mathematical calculations to account for the curvature of the Earth, recording data with the obsessive precision of someone who understood that microscopic variations in ammunition could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But the technical aspects were only part of her education. Elena had transformed herself into a student of disciplines that weren't taught in any military academy. Meteorology became essential when shots extended beyond conventional ranges. She'd constructed weather monitoring stations at elevation intervals throughout the valley, each one equipped with instruments that measured wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure with laboratory precision. She'd learned to read atmospheric conditions like a language, interpreting data patterns that predicted how bullets would behave in flight paths measured in seconds and distances measured in miles. The mathematics were beautiful in their complexity. Ballistic coefficients that described how efficiently bullets shed atmospheric resistance. Spin drift calculations that accounted for projectile rotation over extreme distances. Coriolis effects that factored in the Earth's rotation during bullet flight times approaching 4 seconds. Elena had built computational models that incorporated dozens of variables, creating firing solutions accurate enough to predict impact points within inches at distances where targets appeared as microscopic dots through even the most powerful optics. But knowledge without application remained academic exercise. Elena had constructed shooting positions throughout the valley that tested every aspect of her evolving capabilities. The closest range was 300 yards, used for routine practice and equipment verification. The longest extended to 2,200 yards, a distance that pushed beyond what most people considered possible with small arms fire. Each position was camouflaged with the thoroughness of someone who understood that concealment meant survival. Earth and timber constructed to look like natural terrain features. Vegetation cultivated to match surrounding forest patterns. Approach routes planned to minimize visibility from aerial surveillance that might occasionally pass overhead. She'd learned patience through repetition that bordered on meditation. Alina would occupy shooting positions for days at a time, waiting for atmospheric conditions that aligned with her training objectives. Wind speeds that tested her ability to calculate holdover adjustments. Temperature variations that demonstrated how environmental factors affected bullet velocity. Light conditions that challenged her ability to read mirage. Patterns that revealed information about air currents, invisible to casual observation. The psychological discipline was harder than the technical mastery. Alina had always been comfortable with solitude, but 5 years of complete isolation tested mental resilience in ways that military training hadn't prepared her for. She'd developed routines that provided structure to days that could otherwise blur into meaningless repetition. Physical conditioning consumed the hours between dawn and full daylight. Alina had built obstacle courses through terrain that challenged every aspect of battlefield mobility. Rope climbs using trees that required upper body strength beyond what most soldiers maintained. Carrying exercises with loads that simulated combat equipment across distances that tested cardiovascular endurance. Balance and agility training on logs suspended over creek beds that punished mistakes with ice-cold immersion. The mental training was equally demanding. Alina had memorized technical manuals that covered everything from advanced ballistics to field medicine to survival techniques applicable to environments ranging from desert to Arctic. She'd studied languages that might prove useful if circumstances forced her to operate in foreign countries. She'd maintained proficiency in skills that had nothing to do with shooting, but everything to do with remaining invisible in a world that believed she was dead. Lockpicking, document forgery, surveillance detection, counter-surveillance techniques, identity construction, financial systems manipulation. Alina had educated herself in capabilities that would allow her to emerge from the wilderness and function in civilian society without leaving traces that might attract attention from people who believed she was safely buried in Arlington National Cemetery. But the most important lessons were ones she taught herself through experimentation that couldn't be found in any manual. Alina had learned to move through terrain without leaving a sign that would indicate human passage. Footstep placement that avoided crushing vegetation. Weight distribution that prevented soil compression. Route selection that utilized natural camouflage and avoided areas where human passage would be obvious to trained observers. She could traverse miles of wilderness and leave less evidence than a deer following familiar trails. Camouflage became an art form that went beyond anything she'd learned in military training. Alina had studied how light behaved in forest environments, learning to position herself in shadows that rendered her invisible to observation from any angle. She'd learned to construct hides that could conceal her presence from searchers who passed within feet of her location. She'd practiced remaining motionless for periods that tested the limits of human endurance, controlling breathing and heartbeat to levels that approached suspended animation. The weapons maintenance went beyond anything required in military service. Alina had learned to manufacture replacement parts using machine tools salvaged from abandoned industrial sites. She could fabricate components that matched original specifications using raw materials and hand-operated equipment. Her rifles were maintained to tolerances that exceeded factory standards. Every moving part fitted and finished with precision that would satisfy the most demanding bencherous competitors. But more importantly, she'd learned to maintain her mental edge through challenges that pushed beyond what she'd experienced in operational environments. Alina had developed training scenarios that simulated the stress of combat decision-making without the resources and support structures available to military units. She'd practiced making accurate shots while exhausted, hypothermic, sleep-deprived, and operating under time constraints that allowed no margin for error. The psychological warfare she'd conducted against herself was ruthless in its effectiveness. Elena had learned to function despite pain, fatigue, hunger, and emotional isolation that would have broken most people within weeks. She developed mental resilience that went beyond what military psychology considered possible, forging herself into something harder and more capable than she'd been when she'd worn the uniform. Every morning brought new challenges she'd designed to test capabilities she developed through methods that weren't documented in any training manual. Long-range shooting in weather conditions that would ground aircraft. Navigation exercises through terrain that challenged her ability to move undetected across distances measured in dozens of miles. Survival scenarios that tested her ability to procure food, water, shelter, and security using nothing but equipment she could carry in a single pack. But the most valuable education came from learning to think like someone who no longer existed in any official capacity. Elena Rodriguez was dead, buried beneath a marble headstone that bore her name and service dates. The woman who'd taken her place in the Montana wilderness was something new, unconstrained by regulations, protocols, and institutional limitations that had defined her military service. She'd learned to make decisions without consulting superiors, who might prioritize political considerations over operational effectiveness. She'd learned to acquire resources without submitting requisitions, through supply channels that created paper trails. She'd learned to plan operations without briefing committees that might compromise security through oversight procedures. Most importantly, she'd learned to trust herself completely. Every decision, every calculation, every risk assessment was hers alone to make. There were no backup systems, no redundant capabilities, no rescue operations if things went wrong. Elena had become entirely self-reliant in ways that most people couldn't comprehend, developing capabilities that made her more dangerous than any soldier who'd ever served in any military unit. The abandoned radar station had become her university, and she'd spent 5 years earning advanced degrees in subjects that weren't taught anywhere else. When circumstances finally forced her to emerge from the wilderness, Elena Rodriguez would possess knowledge and skills that made her more capable than she'd been at the height of her military career. She'd learned everything necessary to win a war that hadn't started yet. The radio transmission crackled through static at 0347 hours, breaking 5 years of deliberate silence like a gunshot through cathedral quiet. Elena jerked awake in her cabin, muscle memory from 1,000 combat deployments bringing her to full alertness before conscious thought had processed what she'd heard. The emergency frequency wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The encryption protocol had been discontinued when Elena Rodriguez officially died. The call sign echoing through her modified receiver belonged to someone who should have forgotten she'd ever existed. Ghost actual, priority flash. Traffic, authentication code Whiskey 77 Tango. Immediate response required. Elena stared at the radio equipment she'd maintained, but never expected to use. Agent Harrison's voice carried through the atmospheric interference with the kind of controlled urgency that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. Authentication codes weren't used for routine communications. Priority flash traffic indicated situations that threatened national security at the highest levels. She'd built the communication array during her 2nd year in the wilderness, telling herself it was merely prudent contingency planning. High-frequency radio capable of reaching anywhere in North America. Encryption modules acquired through channels that asked no questions. Antenna systems disguised as amateur RADIO equipment that would pass casual inspection from anyone who might stumble across her installation, but she'd never intended to answer. Elena had spent 5 years learning to exist without connection to the world that had discarded her. The radio represented a doorway back to responsibilities she'd been forced to abandon, to loyalties that had been severed by bureaucratic necessity, to a system that had decided her skills were too dangerous to acknowledge. The transmission repeated, Harrison's voice carrying undertones of desperation that Elena had never heard from him during their operational deployments together. He'd been her handler for 18 months before her official death, managing missions that existed in the shadows between official policy and operational necessity. His calls had always been crisp, professional, devoid of emotion that might complicate decision-making under pressure. This was different. Elena reached for the handset, then stopped. Responding would confirm her survival to people who'd spent considerable effort ensuring her death remained convincing. Breaking communication protocol after 5 years of silence would trigger security reviews that might expose her location, compromise her carefully constructed isolation, drag her back into conflicts she'd been forced to abandon. But the authentication code was one she'd never heard before. Personal emergency protocol, reserved for situations that transcended operational considerations. Harrison wasn't calling as her former handler. He was calling as someone who needed help that couldn't be obtained through official channels. She keyed the microphone with fingers that trembled slightly despite 5 years of emotional conditioning. Ghost actually authenticated. Send traffic. The pause stretched long enough that Elena wondered if atmospheric conditions had disrupted the transmission. Then Harrison's voice returned, tight with relief and something that sounded like controlled. Panic. Ghost, we have a developing situation that requires immediate consultation. Cannot discuss over unsecured channels. Request an emergency meeting using protocols established under Operation Blackwater. Can you comply? Operation Blackwater. Elena's memory snapped back to procedures established during her final active mission, contingency protocols designed for situations too sensitive for normal communication methods. Dead drops in locations that wouldn't appear on any surveillance radar. Meeting schedules based on astronomical events that couldn't be predicted by hostile intelligence services. Security procedures that assumed every electronic communication was compromised. Negative on immediate compliance, Elena transmitted. Requires 48 hours of preparation time. Acknowledge understanding of Blackwater protocols. Understood. The emergency nature of the situation makes delay problematic, but acknowledge your operational requirements. Ghost, this involves people you trained with, people you served beside. The situation is deteriorating rapidly, and we're running out of options. The transmission ended with the abruptness of someone who'd said more than security protocols recommended. Elena stared at the radio, processing implications that sent cold certainty through her chest. Harrison wouldn't have broken 5 years of operational silence for anything less than existential threat. He wouldn't have mentioned her former comrades unless they were directly involved in whatever crisis was developing. Most importantly, he wouldn't have used emergency protocols unless official channels had failed completely. Elena began moving, with efficiency that came from muscle memory refined through thousands of training repetitions. The cabin had to be secured for extended absence. Equipment that couldn't be replaced had to be cached in locations where it would survive her disappearance. Transportation had to be arranged using methods that wouldn't create records linking her to destinations that might compromise her. Anonymity. The vehicle she'd maintained for emergencies was a 15-year-old pickup truck purchased through a shell identity and modified with components that wouldn't attract attention from casual observation. The engine had been rebuilt with performance specifications that exceeded factory standards. The suspension was reinforced for off-road travel through terrain that would challenge military vehicles. Most importantly, the registration and insurance documentation would pass routine law enforcement scrutiny, while providing no traceable connection to Elena Rodriguez or any of the identities she'd constructed during her exile. But preparation for the meeting required more than transportation. Elena spent 18 hours constructing an identity that would allow her to move through civilian areas without triggering recognition from people who might remember her face from military service or memorial ceremonies. Hair dye changed her. natural black to auburn brown. Contact lenses shifted her eye color from dark brown to green. Carefully applied makeup altered facial structure in subtle ways that would defeat casual recognition, while remaining natural enough to avoid attracting attention. The clothing was selected for operational effectiveness disguised as civilian normalcy. Hiking boots that would provide traction on any terrain while appearing suitable for recreational outdoor activities. Cargo pants with pockets positioned for equipment access, but styled to look like standard outdoor wear. A jacket with concealed compartments for tools and weapons while maintaining the appearance of routine outdoor clothing. Most importantly, she assembled an identity kit that would support extended operations away from her mountain sanctuary. Driver's license and credit cards for Sarah Mitchell, the freelance writer identity she'd maintained through periodic maintenance of online presence and financial activity. Cash acquired through methods that created no traceable connection to banking systems. Maps and navigation equipment that would allow travel through routes that avoided surveillance cameras and traffic monitoring systems. The weapon selection required careful consideration of operational requirements balanced against legal complications that could arise from transportation and possession. Elena chose a rifle that could be broken down into components small enough to fit in a photographer's equipment case, assembled from parts that weren't regulated by federal firearms legislation but could be combined into something far more capable than its components suggested. Ammunition was limited to what she could conceal within other equipment without attracting attention from law enforcement or security personnel who might conduct routine searches. 50 rounds of match-grade ammunition that she'd loaded to specifications that exceeded anything available through commercial sources. Each round capable of accuracy that would satisfy the most demanding precision shooting requirements at distances that challenged the limits of physics. But the most important preparation was psychological. Elena had spent 5 years learning to exist without connection to her former life, developing emotional resilience that allowed her to function despite complete isolation from human contact. Responding to Harrison's emergency transmission meant opening doors to responsibilities and loyalties she'd been forced to abandon, accepting risks that might compromise the security she'd built through years of careful invisibility. The drive to the meeting location required 12 hours through terrain that tested her modified vehicle's capabilities. Mountain roads that weren't maintained for civilian traffic. Forest Service trails that challenged suspension systems designed for highway use. Finally, hiking trails that required travel on foot through wilderness that would conceal her approach from surveillance methods that might be monitoring the area. The Blackwater Protocol specified a location that would be familiar to Elena, but unknown to anyone who hadn't participated in the original operation. An abandoned mining claim in national forest land, accessed through trails that weren't marked on recreational maps. The site offered clear sight lines for security observation, while providing concealment from aerial surveillance that might be monitoring the region. Elena arrived 6 hours before the scheduled meeting time, using the interval to conduct surveillance that would detect any indication of hostile presence or security compromise. She established observation posts at 3 locations surrounding the meeting site, each one camouflaged to provide concealment while offering overlapping fields of view that covered all possible approach routes. Through high-powered optics, she tracked normal wildlife activity that indicated the absence of human presence that might threaten operational security. Birds following natural feeding patterns rather than scattering from disturbances that would suggest surveillance teams in the area. Deer moving along established trails without the nervous alertness that would indicate predators or humans disrupting their environment. But most importantly, she watched for signs that might indicate the meeting was a trap designed to capture or eliminate someone who was supposed to be dead. Harrison arrived alone, exactly on schedule, using approach routes that matched procedures established during their operational partnership. Elena watched him conduct Counter-surveillance sweeps that demonstrated he was aware of potential threats, but confident that he hadn't been followed. His movements carried the controlled efficiency of someone operating under extreme stress, but maintaining professional discipline despite personal concerns. She waited an additional 30 minutes before breaking concealment, using the time to verify that Harrison hadn't been followed by surveillance teams operating with sophisticated methods that might escape casual detection. Only when she was satisfied that the meeting site was secure did she emerge from her hide, moving with silence that made her approach invisible until she spoke from 20 feet behind Harrison's position. "You look older," she said. Harrison spun around with reflexes that hadn't deteriorated despite years of desk assignments, his hand reaching for a sidearm before conscious recognition stopped the motion. His face showed relief mixed with something that looked like grief, as if seeing her confirmed losses he'd tried not to calculate. "Elena Rodriguez," he said. 5 years. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure either. But you used emergency authentication. That means people are dying, and you can't stop it through normal channels." Harrison nodded, his expression shifting to the professional focus she remembered from mission briefings. 3 days ago, a team infiltrated the Riverside Federal Building in Sacramento. 12 hostages, all of them family members of military personnel who served in classified operations. The hostage takers have demonstrated knowledge of operations that should be buried deeper than your grave. The implications hit Elena like physical impact. Riverside Federal Building housed regional offices for military family services, Veterans Affairs, and casualty notification operations. Anyone planning an attack there would have access to records identifying families of soldiers who'd served in units that didn't officially exist. "What do they want?" she asked. "Public disclosure of military operations conducted between 2015 and 2019. Full congressional hearings. Criminal prosecution of commanding officers who authorized missions that violated international law. Release of classified documents that would expose every off-books operation conducted during that period." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet as the full scope of the crisis became clear. Public exposure of those operations wouldn't just embarrass politicians or end military careers. It would expose methods and capabilities that kept American forces alive in hostile environments. It would compromise ongoing operations in a dozen countries. It would identify assets who would be killed within hours of their names appearing in congressional testimony. And it would reveal that Elena Rodriguez hadn't died in a training accident. "How much do they know?" she asked. Harrison's expression told her the answer was worse than she'd feared. "They have operational reports from missions you conducted. They know about your presumed death. They're threatening to release everything unless their demands are met within 72 hours. Elena stared at him, processing implications that cascaded through every aspect of her carefully constructed invisibility. If the hostage-takers had detailed knowledge of classified operations, they had access to sources within the intelligence community. If they knew about her fake death, they might know about her survival. If they were willing to expose military operations for political purposes, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate people who posed threats to their objectives. "Who are they?" she asked. "We don't know. Communications have been managed through intermediaries who demonstrate sophisticated understanding of operational security. No demands for money, no political manifestos, no indication of foreign sponsorship. Just methodical pressure designed to force disclosure of information that would cripple American intelligence capabilities." Elena understood the tactical situation with clarity that came from years of operational experience. The hostage-takers weren't terrorists or criminals. They were professionals conducting an operation designed to achieve specific political objectives through methods that wouldn't leave traces pointing back to their sponsors. The kind of people who could plan operations that official agencies couldn't counter through conventional methods. The kind of people who would require someone like Elena Rodriguez, to stop them. "You want me to go back?" she said. Harrison nodded. "Officially, we can't ask. Elena Rodriguez is dead, and bringing her back to life would expose everything we've worked to keep buried. Unofficially, you're the only person with the skills necessary to resolve this situation before it destroys everything we've built." Elena looked out across the wilderness that had been her home for 5 years, understanding that responding to this crisis would end the isolation that had kept her safe from people who decided she was too dangerous to acknowledge. But the alternative was watching former comrades die for political objectives she couldn't accept. 72 hours, she said. Less now. 68 hours and counting. Elena Rodriguez had officially died 5 years ago, buried beneath a headstone that bore her name and service dates. But the woman who'd taken her place in the Montana wilderness was something more dangerous than any soldier who'd ever worn the uniform. And now the world was about to find out why some ghosts refused to stay buried. Sacramento's federal district sprawled beneath Elena's observation position, like a circuit board traced in asphalt and glass. The modified spotting scope revealed details that tactical satellites couldn't capture from their orbital altitude. Heat signatures bleeding through window glass, movement patterns of law enforcement personnel who'd been maintaining perimeter security for 36 hours, the subtle positioning of vehicles that indicated command structures and communication protocols. The Riverside Federal Building stood 12 stories above the urban landscape, its brutalist architecture designed more for security than aesthetics. Every window above the 3rd floor had been sealed from the inside, using materials that suggested military training rather than improvised desperation. Light disciplines were being maintained with precision that indicated night vision capabilities. Among the hostage takers, most telling, the building's communication infrastructure had been modified with equipment that would defeat standard electronic surveillance methods. Elena adjusted her position on the parking garage rooftop 1,400 yards from her target, checking wind indicators that hung motionless in the still morning air. The atmospheric conditions were perfect for precision shooting. Temperature stable at 68 degrees. Humidity at 32%. Barometric pressure holding steady. No thermal distortion rising from concrete surfaces that could deflect. Bullets traveling at distances measured in seconds, rather than fractions thereof. But this wasn't a standard sniper engagement. The hostage takers had positioned themselves with tactical awareness that demonstrated professional military training. Overlapping fields of observation that eliminated dead spaces where an attacker might approach undetected. Defensive positions that utilized the building's architecture to create natural barriers against assault from conventional angles. Most importantly, hostage placement that made any direct action scenario unacceptably risky for the people Elena was supposed to protect. Through her scope, she could see partial silhouettes moving past windows on the building's 7th floor. Thermal imaging revealed heat signatures that suggested 12 distinct individuals, matching the reported number of hostages taken during the initial assault. But distinguishing between captors and captives required analysis that pushed beyond what optical surveillance could provide. The FBI command post occupied the entire 4th floor of the office building across the street, its windows covered with blackout curtains that couldn't hide the electronic signature of communication equipment that filled the air with encrypted radio traffic. Elena had monitored their frequencies during her approach to the operational area, learning enough about their tactical plan to understand why Harrison had made his emergency transmission 48 hours earlier. The Bureau's hostage rescue team was trained for situations involving criminals or terrorists who operated with limited tactical sophistication. Their standard procedures assumed hostage takers who would make mistakes, reveal positions, create opportunities for dynamic entry that could resolve situations through overwhelming application of force applied with surgical precision. These hostage takers were different. They demonstrated understanding of federal law enforcement tactics that suggested inside knowledge of Bureau procedures. They'd positioned themselves to neutralize every advantage that conventional assault teams relied upon. They'd turned the Riverside Federal Building into a fortress that could withstand siege operations while maintaining leverage through hostage placement that made casualties inevitable during any rescue attempt. Elena's earpiece crackled with Harrison's voice, transmitted through encrypted communication equipment she'd assembled during her preparation for the mission. Status report. In position. Target assessment complete. This isn't a standard hostage situation. Explain. Elena tracked her scope across the building's facade, analyzing details that painted a picture of adversaries who understood exactly what they were fighting against. Defensive positions are too sophisticated for amateur operation. Window modifications show military engineering knowledge. Communication discipline indicates professional training. These people have studied federal response procedures and positioned themselves to defeat standard tactical approaches. Through her earpiece, Elena could hear background noise that suggested Harrison was operating from within the FBI command post, coordinating between official agencies and resources that didn't appear on any organizational chart. Can you provide Overwatch support for HRT assault? Negative. Hostage placement makes clean shots impossible from any available position. Any attempt at precision elimination would likely result in civilian casualties that we can't accept. The tactical problem was more complex than what conventional military training prepared soldiers to handle. Elena could identify at least 3 positions where hostage takers had established firing positions that commanded approaches the hostage rescue team would be forced to use during building penetration. But each position was located within feet of where hostages were being held, creating scenarios where successful shots against hostile targets might result in collateral damage among the people she was supposed to protect. What do you recommend? Harrison asked. Elena shifted her position slightly, using the movement to check thermal readings that might reveal information not visible through optical surveillance. I need to get inside. The silence stretching through her earpiece told her. Harrison understood the implications of what she was suggesting. Getting inside the building meant abandoning the advantages of range and concealment that made sniper operations effective. It meant accepting risks that couldn't be calculated or controlled through careful planning and superior equipment. It meant operating in close proximity to adversaries who demonstrated capabilities that matched her own professional training. Elena, you've been out of the field for 5 years. These people have killed 2 law enforcement officers and demonstrated tactical awareness that suggests special operations background. Going inside would be suicide. But Elena had spent those 5 years developing capabilities that exceeded anything she'd possessed during active military service. The wilderness training had refined her ability to move undetected through terrain that would challenge reconnaissance specialists. The technical education had expanded her knowledge of weapon systems, explosives, and electronic warfare beyond what special forces units maintained. Most importantly, the psychological conditioning had prepared her to operate alone against adversaries who assumed she would follow conventional tactical doctrine. I've been training, she said. 5 years of preparation for exactly this kind of situation. I can get inside and provide tactical intelligence that will enable successful rescue operations. Elena broke down her rifle and packed the components into a case designed to look like photographic equipment. The backup weapons she'd brought were selected for close quarters engagement, a suppressed pistol loaded with subsonic ammunition that would minimize acoustic signature, a tactical knife balanced for throwing accuracy, and explosive devices small enough to conceal but powerful enough to create diversions that could shift tactical advantage during critical moments. But her most important weapon was knowledge acquired through 5 years of studying building construction, security systems, and urban infiltration techniques that weren't taught in any military course. Elena had learned to move through structures using methods that would defeat security measures designed to detect conventional intrusion attempts. She understood how buildings were wired for electricity, water, communications, and climate control. Knowledge that could be exploited to gain access through routes that defenders wouldn't think to monitor. The Riverside Federal Building had been constructed in 1987 using architectural standards that prioritized earthquake resistance over security. Considerations. Elena had studied the original construction blueprints through online databases that contained more information than the building's current occupants realized was publicly available. She knew about mechanical spaces that weren't included in standard floor plans. She knew about utility tunnels that connected to adjacent structures. Most importantly, she knew about access routes that would allow her to penetrate the building without using entrances that the hostage takers would be monitoring. The storm drainage system beneath Sacramento's federal district was built to handle seasonal flooding that occurred during Northern California's rainy months. The tunnels were large enough to accommodate human passage, connected to every major building through utility access points that were rarely secured against intrusion attempts. Most importantly, the drainage network provided concealment from surveillance methods that might be monitoring street-level approaches to the target area. Elena entered the storm drain system 6 blocks from the federal building using access points that weren't visible from locations where law enforcement had established perimeter security. The concrete tunnels were spacious enough for comfortable movement while providing protection from detection methods that might be scanning for approaching threats. Emergency lighting provided sufficient illumination for navigation without requiring equipment that might create electronic signatures detectable by sophisticated surveillance systems. The infiltration route required 40 minutes of careful movement through infrastructure that most people never knew existed beneath urban areas. Elena moved with silence that made her passage invisible to anyone who might be monitoring the tunnel system, testing each footstep for stability that would prevent sounds from carrying through concrete that could amplify noise in unexpected ways. The access point into the federal building was located in a mechanical room 3 levels below ground, connected to the storm drain through a utility tunnel that had been installed during original construction but forgotten by everyone except maintenance personnel who rarely visited the building's deepest levels. Elena used lock-picking techniques she'd perfected during her wilderness years to bypass security measures that hadn't been updated since the building's construction. The mechanical room contained infrastructure that served the entire building: electrical distribution panels, water pumps, climate control equipment, and communication wiring that connected every floor to external networks. But most importantly, it contained building plans that showed structural details not available in public records, including ventilation shafts, utility chases, and maintenance access routes that could provide concealed movement throughout the structure. Elena studied the building schematics with the attention to detail that had made her successful during military operations. The ventilation system was designed to move air efficiently while meeting safety requirements that mandated emergency access to every section. The utility chases were sized to accommodate future expansion of electrical and communication systems. The maintenance access routes provided service personnel with the ability to reach any area of the building without disrupting normal operations, all of which meant she could move through the building without using corridors, elevators, or stairwells that the hostage takers would be monitoring. The ascent to the 7th floor required 36 minutes of movement through spaces that weren't designed for human passage, but could accommodate someone with Elena's physical conditioning and technical knowledge. Ventilation shafts that challenged flexibility developed through years of wilderness training. Utility chases that required upper body strength maintained through daily conditioning routines. Maintenance tunnels that tested navigation skills refined through cave systems and abandoned mine workings that had served as training environments during her exile. But the most demanding aspect was maintaining Absolute silence while moving through. A structure occupied by people trained to detect exactly this kind of infiltration attempt. Elena controlled her breathing to minimize air movement that might be detectable through acoustic sensors. She distributed her weight to prevent vibrations from traveling through structural elements that could reveal her presence. She moved with timing that coincided with building systems cycling on and off, using mechanical noise to mask sounds that couldn't be completely eliminated. The 7th floor utility access brought her within 20 feet of the room where hostages were being held, close enough to gather intelligence that would enable tactical planning, but too far to take direct action without unacceptable risk to civilian lives. Through acoustic monitoring equipment she'd brought specifically for reconnaissance purposes, Elena could distinguish between different voices, movement patterns, and activity levels that painted a detailed picture of the situation federal agencies were trying to resolve. 12 hostages, all of them family members of soldiers who'd served in classified operations. Elena recognized 2 names from conversations she could overhear, wives of men who'd served in her unit during missions that didn't officially exist. Women who'd spent years wondering why their husbands couldn't discuss their military service, never knowing their silence-protected operations that kept American forces alive in hostile environments around the world. 4 hostage takers, speaking in voices that carried the controlled discipline of professional military training. Elena could identify accents that suggested diverse backgrounds, possibly international recruitment rather than domestic terrorist organization. Most concerning, she could hear technical discussions that demonstrated knowledge of military procedures that should have been classified beyond their access level. But the most important intelligence was tactical positioning that revealed vulnerability the FBI surveillance couldn't detect from their external positions. The hostage takers had established overlapping fields of fire that covered conventional approach routes, but they'd positioned themselves based on assumptions about how rescue operations would be conducted. They'd prepared for dynamic entry through doors and windows. They'd positioned defensive obstacles to channel attackers into kill zones where superior firepower could defeat numerical advantage, but they hadn't prepared for someone who could approach from directions that violated every assumption about how rescue operations were supposed to work. Elena began moving through utility spaces that brought her closer to each defensive position, gathering information that would allow her to engage all 4 hostage takers simultaneously before any of them could react by threatening civilian lives. The approach required movement through areas that pushed the boundaries of human physical capability, but 5 years of wilderness conditioning had prepared her body for challenges that exceeded what conventional military training could provide. First position was occupied by someone speaking with authority that suggested a leadership role within the group. Elena could approach within 8 feet using ventilation ductwork that opened directly above his location. Clear shot angle. No hostages within potential line of fire. Single suppressed round would neutralize the threat without alerting the other. 3 to her presence, the second position offered similar tactical advantages. Approach through utility chase that connected to electrical panels mounted on the wall behind the target's location. Range of 6 feet. Clean shooting angle that avoided any risk to civilian lives. Suppressed ammunition would keep the engagement below acoustic threshold that might trigger response from remaining hostage takers. The 3rd and 4th positions were more complex, requiring coordinated engagement that would eliminate both threats within the seconds before either could react. By threatening hostages, Elena identified approach routes that would bring her within effective range of both positions while using building infrastructure to provide concealment until the moment of engagement. But success required timing that left no margin for error. Executed by someone operating alone against adversaries who demonstrated professional competence in exactly this kind of tactical environment. Elena Rodriguez had been officially dead for 5 years, buried beneath a headstone that bore her name and service dates. But the woman who'd taken her place in the Montana wilderness had spent those years developing capabilities that made her more dangerous than any soldier who'd ever worn the uniform. Through her encrypted communicator, she transmitted her final status report to Harrison. 4 hostiles. 12 friendly civilians. Tactical situation suitable for single operator resolution. Request standby for extraction in approximately 8 minutes. Elena, wait for HRT backup. You don't have to do this alone. But Elena was already moving toward the first position, her suppressed pistol ready. 5 years of preparation distilled into the next few moments that would determine whether 12 innocent people went home to their families or became casualties of political conflicts they'd never chosen to join. She'd spent 5 years learning to be a ghost. Now it was time to remind the world why ghosts were something to fear. The ventilation grate above the first hostile position gave way with a whisper of displaced air that matched the building's mechanical rhythm. Elena descended through the opening like smoke given form, her movements controlled by muscles that had learned precision through 5 years of practice that pushed beyond what human bodies were supposed to accomplish. Marcus Chun never heard her coming, the man who'd spent 18 months planning an operation designed to expose America's most classified military programs, was studying tactical displays on equipment that cost more than most people's annual salaries. His attention was focused on FBI communication intercepts that told him exactly how federal agencies were responding to his demands. He was monitoring law enforcement positioning through surveillance systems he'd installed throughout the building's perimeter. He never looked up. Elena's suppressed pistol touched the base of his skull with pressure so light he might have mistaken it for a falling dust particle. The subsonic round traveled less than an inch before impact, eliminating the threat with acoustic signature barely audible above the building's ambient noise level. Chun collapsed forward onto his equipment, blood spreading across displays that showed federal tactical positions he would never use again. Elena was already moving toward the second position before his body finished falling. The utility chase behind the eastern wall provided concealment that brought her within arm's reach of Dmitry Volkov, a former Spetsnaz operator whose military records had been expunged after he'd disappeared during a prisoner exchange that never officially occurred. He was monitoring communications equipment that intercepted federal law enforcement frequencies, providing real-time intelligence about rescue operations being planned in the command post across the street. Elena emerged from the utility access behind him like a shadow gaining substance. Volkov's peripheral vision caught movement, his hand reaching for the sidearm holstered at his hip with reflexes that had kept him alive. Through conflicts in places that didn't appear on any map, he was fast. Elena was faster. The tactical knife entered beneath his left ear and traversed to the opposite side of his throat, severing arteries and vocal cords with surgical precision that prevented any sound from escaping his lungs. Elena maintained pressure on the blade until his struggles ceased, lowering his body to prevent impact noise that might alert the remaining hostage takers to her presence. 2 down, 2 remaining. 12 hostages are still in immediate danger. Third and fourth positions required coordinated engagement that would test everything Elena had learned during 5 years of solitary preparation. Sarah Kim and Thomas Bradley occupied defensive positions at opposite ends of the room where hostages were being held, each one positioned to provide covering fire for the other while maintaining clear sight lines to civilian targets who could be eliminated instantly if rescue operations went wrong. Elena had identified approach routes that would bring her within effective engagement range of both positions. But success required movement through areas that offered no concealment from either hostile if they turned their attention away from external threats they were expecting federal agencies to present. The solution required creating tactical conditions that didn't exist in any military manual. Elena used electronic warfare equipment she'd constructed during her wilderness years to send false signals through law enforcement Communication frequencies that Kim and Bradley were monitoring. Radio traffic that suggested FBI hostage rescue. Teams were beginning dynamic entry procedures through the building's main entrances. Coordinated reports of tactical movement that would draw their attention toward approaches they'd prepared to defend against. While Kim and Bradley focused their attention on non-existent threats approaching through conventional routes, Elena moved through ceiling spaces that brought her directly above both positions. The approach required traversing structural elements that wouldn't support normal body weight. Using distribution techniques she'd developed through years of practice in environments that punished mistakes with broken bones and mission failure, she positioned herself at the junction of ventilation ducts that provided clear sight lines to both targets while offering concealment that would prevent detection until the moment of engagement. Kim was 8 feet below and 12 feet east. Bradley was 6 feet below and 18 feet west. Both were armed with automatic weapons that could eliminate hostages faster than any rescue operation could prevent casualties. Elena had one opportunity: to eliminate both threats before either could react by killing innocent people. She dropped through the ceiling with timing that caught both hostage takers during the 3-second window when their attention was focused on false tactical displays, rather than the space above their heads. The suppressed pistol in her right hand engaged Kim with 2 rounds center mass that eliminated the threat before her target could process what was happening. Elena's left hand threw the tactical knife with accuracy that sent the blade through Bradley's throat before he could shift his weapon toward hostages, who were cowering against the room's far wall. 4 hostiles eliminated. 12 civilians were secured. The mission was completed in 7 minutes and 36 seconds. But Elena's success created problems that federal agencies weren't prepared to handle. The FBI command post erupted in confusion when surveillance systems suddenly showed the 7th floor clear of hostile activity. Thermal imaging revealed hostage signatures moving freely through areas that had been controlled by armed adversaries moments earlier. Communication intercepts showed silence from people who'd been transmitting tactical intelligence continuously. For 36 hours, what the hell just happened? The FBI hostage rescue team commander stared at displays that showed a situation resolved through methods his training hadn't prepared him to understand. Did they surrender? Are we looking at suicide scenario? Someone give me real-time intelligence. Harrison monitored federal communications from his position within the command structure while maintaining encrypted contact with Elena through channels that wouldn't appear in official records of the incident. Status report. Mission complete. All hostiles eliminated. All civilians secured and ready for evacuation. Recommend immediate medical response for 2 hostages showing signs of trauma-related shock. How do we explain what happened? Elena was already moving toward her extraction route, leaving behind a scene that would challenge investigators who needed explanations that made sense within conventional understanding of how hostage rescue operations worked. You don't let federal agencies take credit for successful resolutions. I was never here. The FBI's tactical teams entered the building expecting armed resistance from adversaries who'd demonstrated professional military capabilities. Instead, they found 12 traumatized but physically unharmed hostages, 4 deceased hostage takers who'd been eliminated through methods that suggested special operations involvement, and no evidence indicating how the rescue had been accomplished. The medical response team found hostages who described hearing gunshots that sounded like air compressors cycling, followed by silence that stretched until federal agents arrived to escort them to safety. Their descriptions of the rescue were fragmentary, confused by trauma and the darkness that had concealed Elena's movements during the critical moments when their lives had hung in balance. Did you see who shot them? FBI agents asked during preliminary interviews. It happened so fast, said Michelle Torres, wife of a soldier who'd served in Elena's unit during missions that didn't officially exist. One moment they were watching, Their screens talking about killing us if anyone tried to get inside. The next moment it was quiet, and they weren't moving anymore. Someone was there, added Jennifer Walsh, whose husband had been killed in an operation that never appeared in casualty reports. I felt movement in the air above us, like someone dropping from the ceiling, but I never saw anyone. It was like a ghost. The FBI's crime scene investigators found evidence that painted a picture of tactical efficiency that exceeded anything in their experience. The hostage-takers had been eliminated using methods that suggested intimate knowledge of close-quarters combat, building infrastructure, and surveillance systems that had been turned against them with devastating effectiveness. But most puzzling were the approach routes that had been used to reach positions that should have been impossible to access without detection. Ventilation grates that had been opened and replaced with precision that left minimal trace evidence. Utility access points that showed signs of recent passage, but no clear indication of how they'd been navigated. Electronic systems that had been compromised through methods that suggested capabilities beyond what conventional law enforcement agencies maintained. This was professional work, the lead investigator told his supervisor while reviewing preliminary findings. Whoever did this had training that goes beyond special operations, building penetration, electronic warfare, close quarters elimination, tactical coordination. This person operated alone against 4 trained hostiles and completed the mission without civilian casualties. Any leads on identity? None. No physical evidence that would survive forensic analysis. No electronic signatures that point toward involvement by official agencies. Whoever did this was careful enough to avoid leaving traces that would compromise their identity or methods. Meanwhile, Elena was moving through extraction routes that would return her to wilderness isolation before federal agencies finished processing the scene she'd left behind. The stone drain system provided concealment for movement away from the operational area. The modified vehicle she'd positioned 6 blocks from the building would transport her beyond surveillance coverage that might be monitoring approaches to the federal district. But most importantly, the identity she'd constructed for the mission would dissolve back into non-existence through methods that would defeat any investigation attempting to trace her involvement in events that officially hadn't included her participation. By the time FBI agents finished interviewing hostages and processing crime scene evidence, Sarah Mitchell, the freelance writer, had checked out of her hotel and disappeared into traffic patterns that carried thousands of vehicles through Sacramento's metropolitan area every hour. The credit cards and identification documents that had supported her temporary identity would become inactive. The financial accounts would close themselves, and the paper trail would evaporate like morning mist in sunlight. Elena Rodriguez remained, officially dead, buried beneath a headstone that bore her name and service dates in Arlington National Cemetery. The woman who'd saved 12 lives and eliminated 4 threats to national security had never existed in any records that federal agencies might investigate. Harrison received her final transmission, while FBI officials were still trying to understand how their hostage rescue operation had been completed by someone they hadn't deployed. Package delivered. All objectives completed. Returning to the previous location. Do not attempt further contact unless the situation requires similar resolution. The encrypted communication ended with finality that suggested Elena was returning to the isolation that had protected her for 5 years, disappearing back into wilderness that would conceal her from people who might ask uncomfortable questions about capabilities that shouldn't exist in someone who was supposed to be dead, but federal agencies weren't. The only people trying to understand what had happened in the Riverside Federal Building. In secure facilities that didn't appear on any government organizational chart. Analysts studied surveillance data that had captured fragments of the rescue operation. Thermal imaging that showed movement patterns impossible to explain through conventional tactical doctrine. electronic intelligence that suggested involvement by capabilities that exceeded anything in official military inventories. Most concerning, tactical results that implied operational planning by someone with intimate knowledge of classified programs that were supposed to be buried deeper than nuclear waste. "Run the analysis again," ordered a man whose personnel file listed him as deputy director of a State Department office that provided administrative support for embassy security operations. His real responsibilities involved managing problems that could embarrass people with Senate confirmation hearings and presidential security briefings. "Same results," replied the analyst whose computer screens displayed data that challenged every assumption about how the situation should have been resolved. Movement patterns suggest a single operator with capabilities that exceed special operations standards. Building penetration through routes that required intimate knowledge of infrastructure that's not available in public records. Electronic warfare that compromised systems designed to resist military-grade intrusion attempts. Identification possibilities limited. Whoever did this operated with operational security that suggests deep familiarity with counterintelligence methods. But the tactical signature matches patterns from classified operations conducted between 2017 and 2019. The deputy director stared at displays that showed tactical analysis of someone who shouldn't exist, eliminating threats through methods that weren't supposed to be possible. The operational signature was familiar, matching reports from missions that had been buried so deeply that even he had limited access to complete files. Elena Rodriguez. The sniper who'd been too effective for political comfort. The soldier who'd disappeared to protect operations that couldn't survive congressional oversight. The woman who was supposed to be safely dead, her skills buried with her classified service record in graves that would never be disturbed by people asking difficult questions. "She's supposed to be dead," he said. "Yes, sir." Training accident. In March 2019, full military honors. Burial in Arlington National Cemetery. Case file sealed under national security classification. The deputy director reached for a secure telephone that connected him to people who made decisions about problems that threatened operational security at the highest levels of government. Elena Rodriguez had disappeared once to protect classified programs from congressional investigation. If she was alive and operating with capabilities that exceeded her previous service record, she represented a threat that would require permanent resolution through methods that left no room for future complications. But Elena was already beyond the reach of people who might try to solve the problem she represented. The wilderness that had sheltered her for 5 years was vast enough to hide someone who understood how to remain invisible from surveillance methods that could track individuals across entire continents. She had resources, skills, and knowledge that made her more dangerous than any official agency could manage through conventional means. Most importantly, she had nothing left to lose and every reason to remain buried deeper than her official grave. Hostages went home to families who would never fully understand what had saved their lives. The federal agencies took credit for successful resolution of a crisis that had threatened national security. The hostage takers were quietly buried in unmarked graves after autopsies that raised questions no one wanted to answer. And somewhere in the Montana wilderness, a woman who was supposed to be dead returned to isolation that protected secrets more dangerous than any classified document could ever be. Elena Rodriguez had completed her mission and vanished back into non-existence, leaving behind only questions that would never be answered and capabilities that would remain buried until the next crisis forced her to emerge from shadows that had become her permanent home. 3 months after the Kiel, Riverside Federal Building incident, Elena stood at her cabin's single window, watching snow fall across the valley in patterns that would erase her footprints within hours. The weather system moving through the Montana wilderness carried the kind of heavy precipitation that made satellite surveillance impossible and rendered thermal imaging useless beyond a few hundred yards. she'd return to her mountain sanctuary, expecting the same isolation that had protected her for 5 years. Instead, she'd found subtle signs that indicated her location was no longer as secure as she'd believed. Aircraft passed overhead at irregular intervals, following flight patterns that suggested reconnaissance rather than civilian air traffic. Electronic interference that indicated sophisticated monitoring equipment operating within detection range of her position. Most concerning, disturbances in the natural environment that suggested periodic human presence in areas where no one should have been traveling. Elena had spent 6 weeks conducting counter-surveillance operations throughout her territory, using skills refined through 5 years of wilderness training to identify threats that conventional security methods might have missed. The evidence painted a picture that confirmed her worst fears about the consequences of emerging from isolation to complete the Sacramento mission. Someone was hunting her. The footprints she discovered along the eastern ridge were 3 days old when she'd found them, left by someone wearing military-grade boots and moving with tactical discipline that suggested professional training. The track pattern indicated surveillance rather than direct approach, with observation positions established at locations that would provide clear sight lines to her cabin while remaining concealed from casual detection. Electronic signatures detected by equipment she'd built to monitor her perimeter showed regular sweeps by devices that would be used to locate communication equipment, weapons caches, or other infrastructure that might support someone living off-grid in wilderness areas. The sweeps were conducted with sophistication that exceeded what law enforcement agencies typically deployed, suggesting military or intelligence community involvement. Most telling were the supply cache disturbances she discovered at locations throughout the valley. Hidden stockpiles of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and survival equipment that she'd established as contingency resources had been located and photographed, then carefully restored to their original condition by people who wanted her to know they'd been found without triggering immediate flight response. The message was clear. They knew where she was, what resources she maintained, and how she'd structured her survival capabilities. They were demonstrating superior intelligence gathering while allowing her to remain in place, suggesting they wanted something more than simple elimination. Elena activated the secure communication array she'd maintained but never expected to use again, transmitting on frequencies that would reach Harrison through channels that officially didn't exist. The encryption was based on algorithms she'd developed during her isolation, using mathematical concepts that would defeat standard cryptographic analysis while providing authentication that would verify her identity to people who'd worked with her during operational deployments. This is Ghost. Request emergency consultation. Authentication follows. The response came within minutes, confirming that Harrison had been monitoring those frequencies despite official protocols that should have discontinued such surveillance after her presumed death. Authenticated. Situation report. My location has been compromised. Request information about current threat assessment and recommended response protocols. Harrison's voice carried the same controlled tension she'd heard during the Sacramento crisis, suggesting that Elena's survival had created complications that extended beyond her personal security concerns. Elena, you need to understand what happened after Sacramento. The operation was too clean, too professional. People are asking questions about capabilities that shouldn't exist in someone who's supposed to be dead. Through her encrypted communicator, Elena could hear background noise that suggested Harrison was operating from a secure facility rather than his usual office environment. The acoustic signature indicated underground construction, heavy soundproofing, and electronic equipment that would be used for communications requiring the highest levels of classification. What kind of questions? Congressional oversight committees are investigating the incident. They want to know how 12 hostages were rescued without federal agency involvement. They're demanding explanations for tactical methods that exceed what official military units are trained to execute. Most dangerous. They're requesting access to classified personnel files for soldiers who served in operations that might have developed those capabilities. Elena understood the implications, with clarity that came from 5 years of contemplating exactly this scenario. Congressional investigations would expose the off-books programs that had developed her skills. Document reviews would reveal that she'd been too effective for political comfort. Personnel file analysis would discover discrepancies in her death. Records that could lead to questions about other soldiers who disappeared for similar reasons. How much do they know? Enough to threaten everything we've built over the past decade. If they connect Sacramento to your previous operations, they'll have evidence of military programs that violate congressional oversight requirements. They'll demand prosecutions, budget cuts, operational shutdowns that will cripple our ability to protect American interests in hostile environments. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, painting a picture of political vulnerability. That explained why Elena was being hunted by people who should have been grateful for her intervention in Sacramento. Her success had been too dramatic, too obviously professional, too clearly the work of someone with capabilities that exceeded what civilian agencies could provide. She'd saved 12 lives and eliminated 4 threats to national security. In return, she'd exposed the existence of programs that were supposed to remain buried deeper than nuclear waste. Recommendations? Elena asked. Harrison's pause suggested he was consulting with people whose presence he couldn't acknowledge over encrypted communications. When he responded, his voice carried the weight of decisions that had been made in rooms where Elena's survival was being discussed as a problem requiring permanent solution. Official recommendation is voluntary surrender, followed by relocation to a facility where your capabilities can be managed under controlled conditions. Unofficial recommendation is immediate extraction to a location where you can be protected from people who might prefer simpler solutions to the problems you represent. Elena stared across the valley that had been her home for 5 years, understanding that both recommendations meant the end of the freedom she'd built through careful invisibility. Surrender would mean imprisonment disguised as protective custody. Extraction would mean trading one form of isolation for another, living under supervision that would monitor every aspect of her existence. Third option? Complete your disappearance. Make Elena Rodriguez so thoroughly dead that even people who know she survived Sacramento will conclude she's no longer a threat. But Elena, that would mean permanent separation from everything connected to your previous life. No contact with family. No involvement in conflicts that might expose your capabilities. Complete psychological death while maintaining physical survival. Through her window, Elena watched snow continue falling in patterns that would conceal movement across terrain that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The wilderness had taught her lessons about survival that went beyond what military training provided. Sometimes the only way to win was to refuse to play games where victory was defined by other people's rules. I need time to consider options. Elena, you don't have time. Surveillance teams are being deployed to your area with orders that don't include bringing you back alive. You have maybe 72 hours before this situation escalates beyond what I can manage through unofficial channels. The communication ended with Elena staring at equipment that represented her last connection to a world that had decided she was too dangerous to acknowledge. For 5 years, she'd lived with the knowledge that the country she'd served had betrayed her for political convenience. Now she faced the reality that even her successful intervention in a crisis that federal agencies couldn't resolve had been interpreted as a threat requiring elimination. But Elena had learned something during her wilderness exile that the people hunting her hadn't considered. She'd discovered that true freedom came from accepting that some battles could only be won by changing the fundamental assumptions that defined the conflict. Over the next 48 hours, Elena implemented a plan that would make her deaf so convincing that even intelligence agencies with unlimited resources would conclude their problem had been solved permanently. The cabin fire began with explosive devices placed at strategic locations throughout the structure, creating a burn pattern that would destroy evidence while appearing to result from an accident involving a propane heating system. The flames consumed everything that connected Elena Rodriguez to the location where she'd spent 5 years, developing capabilities that exceeded her previous military service. But the woman who walked away from that fire carried resources that would allow her to survive anywhere in the world. Bank accounts established through identities that predated her official death. Weapons caches hidden in locations across 3 states. Communication equipment that would provide secure contact with networks that operated outside official oversight. Most importantly, knowledge that made her more valuable as an ally than dangerous as an enemy to people who understood the realities of protecting American interests in hostile environments. Elena's new identity emerged from planning that had begun during her first year in wilderness exile. Rebecca Walsh, Canadian citizen with immigration documentation that would pass the most sophisticated verification, educational credentials that supported employment in technical fields requiring specialized knowledge, financial history that would justify the resources necessary to disappear completely while maintaining a comfortable lifestyle. The transformation was complete within 6 months. Rebecca Walsh purchased property in rural British Columbia using cash transactions that created no traceable connection to American financial systems. The location offered the same isolation Elena had enjoyed in Montana while providing access to urban areas where she could maintain awareness of global situations that might require her intervention. But most importantly, the new identity provided psychological distance from Elena Rodriguez, while preserving the capabilities that made her useful to people who faced problems that couldn't be solved through official channels. The first contact came 18 months later, delivered through methods that demonstrated intimate knowledge of her new identity and location. A crisis developing in Southeast Asia. American military personnel captured by forces that didn't officially exist. Rescue operations that federal agencies couldn't acknowledge while diplomatic channels remained closed due to political complications. The message was simple: your country needs you again. But this time, you choose the terms. Elena stared at the communication for several minutes, understanding that accepting would mean returning to conflicts she'd been forced to abandon. But it would also mean working with people who understood her value rather than viewing her capabilities as threats, requiring management. She drafted her response with the same precision that had characterized her shooting during military service. Terms accepted. Send mission parameters. Rebecca Walsh became the ghost that Elena Rodriguez had been forced to abandon. A consultant who worked with private security firms that supported American interests while maintaining plausible deniability about government involvement. Someone whose capabilities could be deployed without congressional oversight or media attention. Most importantly, someone whose existence couldn't be traced to classified programs that required protection from political investigation. Over the following years, Rebecca Walsh resolved situations in locations that didn't appear on evening news broadcasts, hostage rescues that were credited to local law enforcement, elimination of threats that were reported as accidents or criminal violence, intelligence gathering that provided information to American agencies without creating records that might complicate future operations. She worked alone, accepting missions that tested every skill she developed through 5 years of wilderness training. Operations that required capabilities exceeding what special forces units maintained. Tactical problems that could only be solved by someone who understood that conventional rules didn't apply when American lives were at stake. But most importantly, she worked for people who understood that some problems required solutions that couldn't be discussed in congressional hearings or newspaper editorials. Elena Rodriguez remained officially dead honored by a headstone that bore her name and service dates in Arlington National Cemetery. Her military service record was buried so deeply that even intelligence analysts with maximum security clearances couldn't access complete files describing her operational achievements. But the woman who'd taken her place in the world was living. Proof that some capabilities couldn't be killed by bureaucratic decisions or political convenience. Rebecca Walsh represented evolution of everything Elena Rodriguez had learned during military service, refined through wilderness exile, and perfected through acceptance that true service to country sometimes required operating outside official recognition or support. The hostages she'd saved in Sacramento never learned the identity of their rescuer. Federal agencies continued claiming credit for successful resolution of a crisis that had threatened national security. Congressional investigators eventually concluded their inquiry, without discovering evidence of programs that were supposed to remain classified, but in secure facilities that didn't appear on any government organizational chart. People responsible for protecting American interests in hostile environments understood that some capabilities were too valuable to waste through political compromise. Rebecca Walsh became a legend whispered in conversations that officially never occurred. The ghost who could solve problems that defeated conventional resources. Someone whose existence couldn't be proven, but whose results spoke for themselves. Through situations that ended better than anyone had thought possible, she'd learned that sometimes the greatest service required accepting that recognition would never come. That protecting people meant working in shadows where heroism went unacknowledged. That true victory came from knowing you'd made the world safer even when no one could thank you for the sacrifice. Elena Rodriguez had died to protect classified operations from congressional investigation. Rebecca Walsh lived to ensure that American interests were protected regardless of political complications that might prevent official response to emerging threats. The transformation was complete. The ghost had found her purpose. And somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, a woman who'd been forced to sacrifice everything for her country had discovered that sometimes losing your identity was the only way to save your soul. The world was a safer place because she existed, even if the world would never know her name. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.